Hey everybody, so my name's Ethan Tapper. I'm the Chittenden County Forester over here in Chittenden County, Vermont, which is up in the northwest corner of Vermont. Um, and it is really fun to be here. I'm a Common Ground fair goer, and I've also attended a MOFGA LAF workshop when I was in the horse logging world. I was apprentice for John Plowden, who I'm sure some of you know, years ago, maybe 10 years ago. And I have really fond memories about coming over there to Unity and spending a lot of really fun time with all you, playing around with horses and chainsaws and stuff like that. So it's really neat to be able to now come in my new capacity as the Chittenden County Forester. So in Vermont, the County Forester program is basically, it's been around since the 40s. I'm sure that in Maine there is something similar, but in Vermont what we do is basically help private landowners figure out how to manage their land well. And so we manage this program, current use program. There's a similar one in Maine where landowners get tax abatement in exchange for managing their land in accordance with a forest management plan, and the county foresters review those plans and we monitor, make sure people are following them. Really important program. We're also just a resource for landowners of parcels of forested land of all shapes and sizes, from a couple acres to thousands of acres. You can just call us up and we come out and take a walk and talk about what's going on and opportunities to manage your land responsibly. We also work with towns to manage their municipal forests, and I do a ton of work with the dozen municipal forests in my county, covering about a little over 4,000 acres, to do demonstration forest management and showcase what forest management done well looks like in the many ways that it supports all the things that we care about, and sort of trying to break down the resistance that a lot of people had towards thinking about logging as something that's really scary and something that's not a part of our world, which of course it is, and is something that can be done and be really positive and regenerative for our forests. And the fourth part is what I call just like whatever. So that's where we answer the question of how do we improve the health of forests and the quality of forest management in the county that we're in, with the people that we have, with the forests that we have, with the opportunities and the threats that are there. And that's where we get to sort of be creative and think about, pragmatically and creatively, how do we do this? And so there's a bunch of different ways that I sort of get at this, but this presentation that I'm going to do today is one that I've been working on for about a year, and it's sort of the combination of a bunch of different stuff. A lot of it is somewhat Vermont focused, so sorry about that, all you Mainers, but a lot of it is, or most of it is more broadly applicable, I hope. And yeah, please hold your questions for the end, and we're going to have time to have a chat after I finish. Every time I do this presentation, it is different, and so it's a wild ride. We'll see if we get all the way through it. And with that, away we go. All right, so the radical forest manager. So when I talk about the word radical, where this presentation really came from was this idea of juxtaposing these two different definitions. So the idea of radical as being something that is very different from the usual, very different from the traditional, something that is just, at the root different, and thinking about ways to fundamentally change the ways we manage forests and the way we think about our relationship to forests. And also at the same time, thinking about not just how do we make our forests better, how do we make our forests healthier, more productive, but how do we also nest that within an idea of equity and justice. So this is the second definition of radical, right? The connotation of advocating for something based on political, social change, social justice, and incorporating those human aspects into the work that we do in addition to those ecological aspects. And so I think that a lot of times in the forest management community or in the community of people who just love forests, we're asking the wrong questions. So what we're asking is, how do we make our forests better? How do we make them healthier? But what we really want to do is we want to create a better world. So we should be asking ourselves, how can forests and forest management help build a better world? And by my definition, a better world is one that includes both ecological integrity, healthy, functional ecosystems, forests that work and that are vibrant and abundant with life, and also equity, justice, happiness, prosperity, opportunity in our human communities. How do we do that at the same time? And within this are nested all these other ideas. So like, there are all these other things that are radically different from the norm. It's not just about blowing up the way that we manage our forests, but it's also about doing things that are challenging, right? So reimagining forests as not just, a bunch of trees, but as complex systems, which are much more than trees and which have intrinsic value, which have the right to exist. And also taking responsibility for doing what we can do to protect and enrich ecosystems which have been profoundly altered, and to protect peoples, both locally and globally. This idea of building a real relationship with forests, a land ethic that is complex, that is nuanced, and that views ourselves as part of something much broader rather than just hyper focusing on exactly where we are in our own little life. Recognizing the legacies that are inherent in our world and trying to leave a world that is better, to leave legacies to future generations that are positive, to leave the world better than we found it. And finally, to have the humility to embrace nuance, to see yourself as part of something bigger, and also to form worldviews that are adaptive and that are willing to change. All these things are really important aspects of this bigger idea of, sort of radically transforming, the way that we manage our forests. And so the first part of this is reimagining the forests themselves. So what's a forest? So most people, you're like, it's like one of those things where you're like, oh, I know it when I see it, right? So you walk into an area, there's trees there, you're like, great, I'm in a forest. But what is a forest really? So we think about them as being defined by trees. So is an area with a bunch of trees in it like this, is this a forest? A definition that I more and more go towards is a more holistic and a more process-based definition. So this is a definition for a natural community, which was posited by Thompson and Sorensen in their book, Wetland, Woodland, Wildland, which is about natural communities of Vermont. They define a natural community as an interacting assemblage of organisms, their physical environment, and the natural processes that affect them. So a forest is not a condition. It's not these trees that are here right now at this moment. It is a dynamic process. It is a community of organisms, number one, but a community that's also in motion, and that includes more than just trees. So there's many different pieces, parts, processes in forests. They're engaged in complex relationships and interactions, and together they comprise a system. The other thing we have to be careful about, though, is that we recognize that they're also not utopias, right? That they're systems, but within that, many parts and pieces of the system they're competing with each other, they're eating each other, they're parasitizing each other. But the sum total of those interactions form these really complex and interesting communities that have emergent properties and stuff like that. Oftentimes, I think of a forest as being like a coral reef. And within that coral reef, trees are the coral, right? So they're a living structure that defines that ecosystem, and that in many ways is, an incredibly important part of it. But none of us would ever think about a coral reef as being, just the coral. We would think about it as this complex volume of life swirling around that living structure. And so when I think of forests, I try and broaden my understanding to include not just the trees, but all those other parts as well. I've been obsessed recently with invertebrates. So our little spineless friends that comprise 97% of the species on Earth. Here's a graphic from Vermont that I just think illustrates so much about our biodiversity and the little things that make our ecosystems work. Excuse me. So here's a graphic that shows all the species, number of different species in Vermont, mammals, birds, fish, amphibians, reptiles, and without the invertebrates, right? You're like, okay, that makes sense. Here's it with the invertebrates. So in Vermont, we have 58 species of mammals, and we have about, we think, and probably many more that we just don't know about, 21,000 species of invertebrates. These are what biologist E.O. Wilson calls the little things that make the world work. They are our pollinators. They are the nutrient cyclers in our forested ecosystems that are allowing dead trees to become these profound living structures in our forests that are providing habitat for tons of different organisms, that are fueling different natural processes, that are influencing the hydrology of our forests, and that are building our future soils. On Earth, we have probably about 2 million invertebrates that we know about, maybe as many as 30 million versus about 60,000 vertebrates, animals with spines. These are also organisms that are really, really important for agriculture. So I know that there's a lot of folks here who are mostly in the agricultural world. Many of these invertebrates, again, that are pollinators and nutrient cyclers, two things which are incredibly important to agriculture, depend on native ecosystems. So stuff like, in Vermont, we have almost 300 species of native bees. They're relying on dead wood and, forest duff layers and stuff like that to provide their habitat. They're not, although they're using our agricultural environments, that's not constituting the whole of their habitat. E.O. Wilson also thinks we should start calling invertebrates wildlife, so I'll just put a plug in for that. If you don't know E.O. Wilson, he's the author of a number of amazing books. He mostly studies ants, but he's the author of a number of amazing books that really celebrate biodiversity. So when I walk with people in the woods, which I do all the time, there is something really weird that for some reason is inside all of us, which is that we have this idealized vision of what a forest is supposed to look like, which is based not on how forests work, but purely on what looks good to us. And so every one of us thinks that this forest, which has big, evenly spaced trees, nothing growing in the understory, looks just beautiful. I don't know where that comes from, but it's in there. And there are many ways that this plays out in the way that we manage forests. People have the idea that they think that we need to clean up forests, like there's a windstorm and everybody freaks out because they think that, we got to get those trees off the ground right away. They think that every time a tree falls over in their woods, they're supposed to go pick it up, which of course isn't true. It's fueled me to think about that. Our understanding of what healthy forests look like and how they work is not something that is innate in any of us. It's something that needs to be developed, because what healthy forests really look like is this. So within forests, death and disturbance is more than just okay, it's a celebration. It's profoundly important. It drives tons of important processes in the forests. It makes forests more complex, by creating space, which is then filled with different species of trees, which regenerate into that and fill that space. The dead wood itself is an incredibly important and profound structure, which is providing habitat for tons of organisms. And over time, death and disturbance is what makes our forests more complex, which also makes them more resilient. If you were to go in an old growth forest, what you'd see is that disturbance and death would be absolutely everywhere. There'd be some big trees, but also dead standing trees, trees of all different shapes and sizes and ages, dead wood on the forest floor, pit and mound topography from generations of trees blowing over. All that stuff would make that old growth forest look really messy, right? Those are also the things that create a lot of these really interesting emergent properties that make old growth forests such profound repositories of biodiversity, and also really cool forests for us to study as we're thinking about how we manage our forests more responsibly. Now, one thing that's really interesting about our misunderstanding of what healthy forests look like is that it also gives us an unrealistic expectation of what managed forests are supposed to look like, right? Because managed forests are messy, and they make people uncomfortable because they look messy. Well, now if you think that forests are supposed to look messy and that deadwood on the ground is a really good thing, and that a forest in which negative space has been created and light has been opened up that's just waiting for that regeneration to fill that space and create some more diversity and complexity in that forest. If you understand that, you're like, wow, this is really exciting. But if you just think that deadwood on the forest floor looks ugly, you're going to think that that logging looks ugly no matter what. In the same way that if you think that forests are supposed to never change, and that trees are supposed to be, stay alive all the time and never die, when you see those stumps, it's going to be really unpleasant for you, because you're going to have an unrealistic expectation of the way that a forest sort of reacts to the process of mortality, which is really important. So when I talk about forests, I often am managing forests and thinking about forests in terms of both diversity. So that's lots of different types of stuff, lots of different species of trees, ages of trees, lots of different types of conditions, and also complexity, which is the quality of many different types of diversity layered over one another, and the complex interactions between them. Both diversity and complexity are linked to increased forest resilience, better wildlife habitat, different habitats for all different species of wildlife, carbon sequestration and storage, and just generally forests which are more adaptive and rich with life. And I should say too that when I talk about diversity, I'm talking about both species diversity, the number of different species in a given area, and also structural diversity, so the number of different sizes and ages of trees that are present throughout the forest. And you can also expand structural diversity to include both living and dead trees. And so as we think about forests, especially with an eye sort of on the future, what we really want to do is trade this traditional idea of stability. So the idea of stability as being, we want to manage a forest that's going to resist change, right? That's going to be able to keep those trees alive as long as possible, which is futile, because forests have a will to change, and they're going to change, to trade that instead for forests which are resilient. So what resilient forests are is forests that are capable of maintaining their health and natural processes throughout great stress and change. So it's a recognition of the way that forests actually work. And instead of trying to replace that system with something else that we think is better, we're instead saying, okay, how do we work with that to keep our forests healthy? And at the same time, we also want to create forests which are adaptive, right? Because we can look at old growth forests all we want, but the future that we're managing forests for now is completely different than the forests that were here 300 years ago. The climate, the animal species that were there, the tree species that were there. We need to manage forests which are adaptable, which can change, and which can be really managed for an uncertain future. And managing for both species diversity and structural diversity, and this is critical. Another way to address this and make our forests more adaptive and resilient is addressing individual threats to biodiversity, like invasive exotic plant species, invasive insects and pests and pathogens, stuff like deer overpopulations. These are all threats to our biodiversity, which also lower the forest's ability to be resilient and to adapt to changing conditions in the future. These are also not just attributes that are important, for some future time when forests are going to be, subject to climate, really bad climatic changes. These are things they're dealing with now. So, we've already lost a lot of species, both wildlife and several dominant species of trees. So here in Chittenden County, Vermont, we know that American beech was our dominant forest species by far. 40 to 60% of all the species in Chittenden County was beech. And due to beech bark disease, and it was this 400 to 1600-year-old shade tolerant, super dominant canopy tree producing all this food for wildlife. And due to beech bark disease, we know that it doesn't grow that way anymore. And so how do we manage forests that are able to adapt to stuff like that? And also stuff like the loss of elm and ash and butternut and chestnut, the advent of these invasive exotic plants, pests, pathogens, and other stuff like deer overpopulation that is an intrinsic and existential threat to the health of our forests now and in the future. So this idea of legacy and thinking about managing forests in a way that is in some way radical by my two definitions, this concept of legacy is really powerful. So obviously we want to think about how do we manage our forests in a way that leaves a positive legacy for future generations. You know, what world do we want to leave to our children and for our children's children? At the same time, we also need to recognize the legacies that we stand on, right? On this altered, degraded, exploited landscape, which I'll talk more about in a second. In the same way, and you know, there's a lot of parallels between the way that we think about the legacies of racism and injustice and inequity in our world. So we don't get to choose the legacies that we inherit, right? We get what we get. This is where we are. The choice that we have is, what are we going to do about it? I should also say that legacy is also a biological term. You know, it's the parts of past generations that reach into the present in the same way that the legacy of the land use of the past, you know, which we personally may have had nothing to do with, now informs our current reality. So prior to European colonization, most in New England was at least 90–95% forested. And so in New England, we think that 55 to 60% of forests were older than 150 years, which, you know, could make them old growth forests, or certainly on track to be old growth forests. When in the early 1800s, increased settlement and land clearing for stuff like merino sheep caused this huge burst of forest clearing in our region. And so in Vermont, in Maine, I know that parts of Maine this is true for, parts of Maine it's less true for. In Vermont, we lost or had cleared or converted to pasture 60 to 80% of our forests in about 30 to 50 years in the early 1800s. So that was absolutely dramatic. And what it means in Vermont and in parts of Maine is that every forest you've ever been in, unless it's really remote, super inaccessible, on the top of a mountain, something like that, was a field during that time. And that is a dramatic influence on our forests. Many of those were also maintained as fields for a century or more. There were a number of influences that were causing our forests to be cleared, and it wasn't just pasture. When I was in school, I learned that it was all just for sheep pasture. In reality, it was for resource exploitation as well, for hardwood charcoal when the railroads ran on charcoal, and a bunch of other stuff. There's a number of pulses of reforestation where in New England you can see these time periods when there was just a lot of fields that were allowed to revert to forest, which usually are related to different changes in our agricultural commodities markets and stuff like that. It's fascinating. So as a result of overhunting and also habitat loss, many species were extirpated from Vermont and from other parts of our region in the 1700s and 1800s. So in Vermont in particular, we lost beaver, turkeys, fisher, moose, caribou, elk, catamount, wolves. Catamount's what we call the eastern puma, mountain lions. Wolves, bear, otter, Canada geese, marten, passenger pigeons, and others. Some of those, like passenger pigeons, catamount, and that species, the eastern elk, which was a forest-dwelling elk which lived here and was extirpated in the 1700s, those are extinct. This is a picture of the last catamount shot in Vermont in 1881 in Barnard. Some of those other ones have been able to come back, but it's a miracle that they're here at all. This is a time that was dramatic, not just in the transformation of our landscapes, but also in the transformation of the biological communities that they support. So again, we're thinking about forests in a more holistic way. So these animals are not just subject to our forests, but they're part of our forests. And that's carried out by the functions that they perform in our forests. So they're not just, you know, we've known for a long time that animals are influenced by ecosystems and that their habitat is provided for them, but less frequently are we thinking about them as also the influencers. Now, the classic example of an animal that influences its habitat is the beaver, right? We all think of it as this keystone species that's damming rivers and protecting wetlands, or creating wetlands, which are creating this massive amount of habitat for all of these different organisms. We think that prior to European colonization, that in Vermont and valley habitats, there may have been as many as 300 beaver per square mile. And so for your frame of reference, that's a beaver dam, or 300 beaver dams per square mile. And so for your frame of reference, that's a beaver dam every 2 acres. Massive, massive influence. By the 1670s, 250,000 beavers had been shipped to Europe from Vermont's Connecticut River Valley alone. So that's a massive influence. It caused the European demand for beaver pelts specifically to make hats for millinery, caused massive, massive social strife in our area, where First Nations went to war over it in the so-called Beaver Wars. They were reintroduced into Vermont in the early 1900s. They're by no means the only example of an animal that was extirpated from our state having a massive influence. Another one that's crazy is the porcupine. So for almost 50 years in Vermont, there was a porcupine bounty where you could turn in a pair of porcupine ears to the town clerk and they would issue you the bounty. And the reason that was such a problem was because the porcupine's native predator, the fisher, was extirpated from our state. And so the populations just exploded and they were like eating people's houses. Other examples of animals that were reintroduced in the early 1900s were white-tailed deer in Vermont, actually reintroduced in the late 1800s, fisher, turkey, beaver, and martins. So it's pretty incredible to think about the influence on our landscape, not just of that land clearing, but also of the communities of animals, and what are the cascading effects of those differences in animal populations that we have now versus what we had just a few hundred years ago. So in addition to that, we have these historic patterns of forest management that were maybe not so great. So we had for centuries completely unregulated logging. So these ideas of what we call high grading, which is where you just go into your woods and you cut all the highest grade logs, you cut all the most valuable logs, you cut all the biggest logs, or what we call diameter limit cutting, which is where you say, okay, we're going to cut every log larger than this diameter. The problem with both of these so-called forest management techniques is that you're degrading the forest, right? You're taking out all of the healthiest trees and effectively encouraging your forest to be less healthy. You're growing your least healthy trees, which is exactly the opposite of generally how we want to manage our forests. There are also some, the forestry ideas that followed that, especially in the early 1900s, were these ideas of the regulated forest, the idea that we're growing forests like fiber farms and that we're going to control every single aspect of the way we grow forests or the way we grow trees. The problem with this is that you can grow trees that way efficiently sometimes, but you can't grow forests that way. So you're not thinking about forest as this complex volume of life. You're thinking about a forest as a bunch of trees. In Vermont, there was also this idea of decadent versus thrifty trees. So decadent trees were these big old trees that we now know to be incredibly important, providing tons of different wildlife habitat and also the really important ecological function like serving as hubs of this underground mycorrhizal fungal network that is allocating resources throughout the forest and helping trees communicate with each other and extract resources from their environment. So those big trees were considered to be decadent and they were killed, sometimes herbicided, just to get them out of the way because they were no longer growing, efficiently growing a valuable wood product. And the idea was that we were going to kill these trees, and instead of growing these big decadent trees, we were going to produce thrifty trees, which were young, fast-growing trees. And obviously, with that came essentially the degradation of our forests and all those benefits those big trees were providing, and also massive, poor protection of our soils. Most people were not stabilizing; they were not treating our waterways well. They were not stabilizing skid roads, and so we had a lot of erosion. And degradation of our waterways. And so the legacy of all these things is that we end up with younger forests. So today, most of the forests in Vermont, at least, are less than 100 years old. And forests that lack these really important elements of old growth structure and that are also associated with healthy forest ecology. So stuff like big old trees, structural and species diversity, different species of trees, different sizes and ages of trees, overall complexity, dead wood on the forest floor, dead standing trees, soil carbon, deep, well-mixed soils. We're also, in addition to lacking diversity in an individual forest, we're also lacking a historical balance of young and old forest across the landscape. So because all of our forests are about the same age, they haven't had time yet to become diverse and to have different natural disturbances affect different areas differently and create effectively patches of forest that are in different stages of growth across the landscape. In addition, we also have altered tree species composition. So I mentioned American beech, which was 40 to 60% of the composition in a lot of places in Vermont, is now 3 to 5%, and altered wildlife species dynamics as a result of the loss of many of those species of wildlife. So bringing us forward towards the future, and I swear I'm going to start talking about stuff to do and not just all the stuff that's wrong in a second. We're also dealing with what we call global change. So, it's tempting to talk about climate change as the main thing that's threatening our ecosystems and our world. But the way that most people talk about this now is in terms of global change, which is climate change plus all of the other human-caused stressors like altered natural disturbance regimes, invasive exotic plants, animals, pests, pathogens, the loss of forests, the conversion of forests to other uses, the fragmentation of large blocks of forest into smaller and smaller pieces, pollution and the despoliation of our forests. The volume of all those things is a better representation of what we're actually facing than just thinking about climate change. So what our forest is facing is this really complex network of all of this different stuff that is together challenging its ability to be healthy. We are also dealing with a mass extinction event where we're losing biodiversity at unprecedented rates, really, really, really fast. Some people call this era that this geologic epic that we're in now, in which humans are a dominant influence on climate and on ecology across the globe, the Anthropocene, the age of humans. And what this means is it's just a profound threat, not just to the many different species that occupy the globe, which are important and beautiful and have the right to exist, but then also to the ability of our ecosystems to work because they're fueled by this biodiversity. This biodiversity is what allows them to be resilient and to adapt. When you look into some of the statistics of the extent of this biodiversity loss that we're experiencing, it's really sobering. So we have now on the planet less than 50% of the animals that were here 50 years ago. So not 50% of the species, 50% of the animals, the number of total animals that were here in 1970 are now alive on the planet. We're experiencing massive increase in our what we call the background extinction rate. So the rate that extinctions normally occur, somewhere between 10 and 10,000 times that background rate. According to some sources, 1 million animal and plant species are threatened with extinction. 40% of amphibians, a third of reef-forming corals, a third of marine mammals, and at least 680 vertebrate species with spines, have been driven to extinction since the 16th century, and perhaps 100,000 species of invertebrates. It's a lot. Globally, it's also a lot. So we're experiencing globally rapid global forest cover loss, globally massive loss of biodiversity. The US is a huge reason for this. Our personal resource consumption, we're less than 5% of the global population, but we're consuming about a third of the globe's resources. And our global resource consumption is increasing. What is also concerning is the idea that the loss of biodiversity, the despoliation of our environment, the effects of climate change, resource extraction, pollution are disproportionately, they're not affecting everybody equally. They're disproportionately affecting poor and more vulnerable communities across the world. So recently, I think many of us are probably aware of this idea of environmental justice, climate justice, and their inverse, environmental injustice, climate injustice. Um, and so basically what this is the idea that the negative environmental effects of our resource consumption, pollution, stuff like this, are disproportionately applied to impoverished communities and communities of color. And this is borne out in a gajillion different ways. There's tons of different facts you could cite. Impoverished communities and communities of color are just more likely to live in polluted areas and have exposure to toxic substances. They're less likely to have clean water. They're less likely to have clean air, more likely to live near a hazardous waste site, more likely to be impacted by climate change. The list goes on and on and on. These impacts are directly related to the extraction and the production and the processing of resources. And so all this to say, like, here, this is where we are, right? So we got to stand on the legacy that we have and recognize that we live in this incredibly highly altered landscape, and in a world where a lot of the things that are that make our world work and are really, really important to us are actively under threat. So then there's this idea of responsibility. So what do we owe to our forests and our other ecosystems? What is our responsibility to work to correct issues, even if we didn't do them, right? Even if these aren't problems that we individually caused. There's this idea, Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's an amazing author, in her wonderful book, Braiding Sweetgrass, talks about this idea that in Western culture, we think about buying land as purchasing a bundle of rights. These are the rights we have. These are the things we can do with our land. No one can take these away from us. Well, why can't we also think about this as a bundle of responsibilities? When we purchase that land, what are the responsibilities that we purchase? Not just the rights, the things we're entitled to. And obviously there are many parallels between how we treat our ecosystems and how we treat each other, right? So what are our responsibilities to correct the inequities and the injustices inherent in our world, even if we didn't, again, individually create them? And how do we stand on the legacies that we have, however uncomfortable that they may be, and move forward, recognizing our responsibility to make the world a little better? So in Maine, as in Vermont, most of our forests are owned by private individuals. In Maine, I think it's about 95%. About half of those are corporate landowners, and the other half are small woodlot owners, individuals, and families. And so what we have with this private land ownership model in the Northeast is we have all of these public benefits, right? So the clean air and clean water and wildlife habitat, carbon sequestration and storage, scenic beauty, pollinator habitat, flood mitigate, all these other things that are ostensibly belong to all of us, right, are produced by forests which are owned by and managed by private individuals. And so there's this idea of sort of this individual freedom versus collective freedom, right? So we have on our land, you'd be like, this is my land, I get to do whatever I want on my land. When in reality, what you do on your land has an influence on your community and on your neighbors and on your globe, and their freedom, just as you have the freedom to do whatever you want, to exploit your forest, to degrade it, to subdivide it and develop it into something that'll never be forest in hundreds of years. We also, that affects the collective freedom of all of us, right? Our freedom to live in a beautiful place, our freedom to live in a place where there's wildlife, and to have our children live in a place where they can experience the same beautiful forest full of wildlife that we do, our freedom to breathe clean air, drink clean water, and the freedom of future generations that don't exist yet to do all those things. And we need to ask ourselves, right, about intrinsic value. So do ecosystems and other species besides humans have the right to exist? So this doesn't need to be our only consideration, and it doesn't need to make us too afraid to do anything, but it does need to be something that we think about. So do we have, as humans, do we have a responsibility to act to protect our ecosystems and our biodiversity, which in and of themselves are important, not just because they do stuff for us, but just because they are? And so how do we form a relationship with our ecosystems that is positive in a holistic sense? Another great book, The Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Kolbert, she reminds us that we are not just, there's this idea of like, you're an environmentalist or you're not, right? Like you can decide to like the environment or not, when in fact, we remain biological organisms which are completely dependent on our ecosystems to exist on the planet. She says, having freed ourselves from the constraints of evolution, humans nevertheless remain dependent on the Earth's biological and geochemical systems. And I would argue completely dependent. I remember I was at a conference and there was like a composting urinal in the bathroom at the conference place. And I was like, went there to go to the bathroom. And as I was looking at it, there was a little plaque on the urinal. It was like, thank you for preserving our environment. And I was like, I don't even know what that means. It's when you start to really think about it, you're like, to even imply that it's a choice to protect this thing, which literally makes it possible for us to live, seems really silly. So one thing that we need, and this is really, really important, and I tell this to people all the time, one thing that we need to recognize is that everything we do, everything we consume, everything we wear, everything we use, everything's made of something. We have to consume resources. We always have, we always will. The question is not, and these resources will always have some kind of an impact on ecosystem. The question is not if we want them to have an impact on our ecosystems. The question is, what do we want this impact to be? So if we accept this idea, it moves us out of this idea that we get to like choose if we're going to impact ecosystems or not. We don't have that choice. We need to either say, I'm going to make this choice actively, or I'm going to make this choice passively. We can choose where our resources come from actively by using local resources, by using resources that we understand. We understand where they come from, we understand what they are. Or we can do so passively, which is just basically abdicating our ability to choose the impacts of our choices and who and what we affect. When we think about this really hard, it may mean that we want to have more of an impact on our ecosystems locally to produce those resources that we need to live and that improve our lives and our quality of life, rather than just outsourcing all our impacts to somewhere we have no idea the impacts of that resource production, extraction, processing on communities and ecosystems somewhere else in the world. This idea of the land ethic by Aldo Leopold, he writes, the land ethic enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, and animals, or collectively the land. A land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens from a conqueror of the land community to a plain member and citizen of it. It implies respect for his fellow members and also respect for the community as such. So this, in my mind, is a real relationship with our ecosystem. So it's not pretending that we're outside of them. It's not pretending that our choices don't have an impact on them. It's saying we are part of this, and so how do we move forward? I would argue that everybody's got a land ethic. Most people define them passively, and very few define them actively. In my own work, excuse me, I see a broad spectrum of different land ethics. I see them as playing out sort of over this, between these two polarities. So on one end, there's the takers. So takers are people who think that the only purpose of forests is to provide us with resources, economic benefits, enjoyment, benefits to us, and that anything we do to create those benefits is okay. On the other side of the spectrum are the leavers. These are the people who believe that anything we do to the forest is wrong, and that nothing we do in relationship with them is okay, that we should be just completely hands-off and completely out of there. In my mind, although these two forces, takers and leavers, they galvanize each other in many ways, they help each other, consolidate themselves, and the existence of each is like an existential threat to the other. In my mind, both of these stances are problematic in their own way, because both of them fail to see themselves as part of ecosystems. They both fail to have a real, actual relationship with ecosystems, with forests, etc. And so takers ignore the idea that their actions can harm ecosystems, that species and ecosystems might have intrinsic value. You know, they might have some value irrespective of their value to the taker, and that managing them just solely for personal benefit could damage the ability of future generations to have that same benefit, right? And leavers disregard the possibility, they're uncreative. They disregard the possibility that there's anything that we could do that could be positive and profound. And they completely leave behind this idea that maybe we have a responsibility to actively correct some of these threats to our ecosystems in order to protect our landscape and our species. I had this experience this year when I killed a deer, and it was in an area where the deer overpopulation was really high. It was causing all these problems to the forest and to its biodiversity, and it was a big deal. And it was I knew I was doing the right thing. I felt great about it, but it was really, really sad. And I thought about, in the same way that I think about, I love trees and I cut trees all the time, and it feels sad. And what I thought about was, why does it have to be like either you cut trees and, like a lot of loggers I know, they cut the trees, they'd be like, what do you care? It's just a friggin' tree, or like a lot of the hunters I know, they'd be like, it's just a friggin' deer, who cares? Why can't it be like, we do these things because we know that they support other positive things that we care about, and they're a big deal, and both of those things can exist at the same time. So at the same time that we're establishing that we're part of ecosystems and that we're biological organisms that are reliant on them, we also need to acknowledge that we have power like no other organism on Earth. And so, like, a beaver can gnaw down trees, but if I hire a feller buncher, it's a completely different thing, orders of magnitude more powerful, right? A beaver can alter hydrology, but if I ran a 30,000-pound excavator for the weekend, I can do it in ways that it could never do that. And so we need to recognize that and then ask ourselves, how do we use power not to degrade ecosystems, but to enrich them, to make them healthier, more complex, and ultimately to help us build a better world? Whoop. There we go. So in addition to reimagining forests, we need to reimagine forest management, right? So, and ask ourselves, how can forest management have a positive influence on forests? And can forests and forest management have a positive influence on our world? And I think the answer is yes. Part of this is, diving into the nuances where, like, we're acknowledging that forest management can be beautiful and regenerative and important, but that doesn't mean that like all forest management is renewable and regenerative and important. Forest management can be done in ways that supports our world, that's profound, and it can also be done in ways that harm ecosystems. And in order for, one of the really radical things is sort of delving into the nuances between those two things and saying, developing a more complex idea of what forest management is. It's not just clear cutting or completely leaving forests alone, that there's so much in there that's just more complex, and that defines whether this is good or bad. So I practice a type of forestry called ecological forestry, also called ecological silviculture, ecological forest management. The idea is that we're managing forests actively, but we're managing them like they manage themselves. So we're managing them as complex systems where we're recognizing the importance of all organisms and processes that makes forests work. And we're doing it based on the ways that old growth forests work, and that natural disturbances naturally change our forests. And I sort of practice a subset of this, which is specifically trying to make younger forests more like old growth forests. So leaving biological legacy trees to be big old trees forever, leaving tons of dead wood on the ground, actively pushing natural disturbance events to try and make our forests more complex and diverse. So what this looks like in practice is many different sizes, ages, and species of trees, retaining tons of dead wood, retaining and recruiting big old, what we call legacy trees. So again, those are trees that are just, if you tell a logger, he's like, why didn't you cut that one, right? And I say, I'm not managing that tree for timber. That's a tree that gets to be a big old tree and confer to the forest the benefits of big old trees and eventually of big dead trees, which is also really important. It also means that we're creating small pockets of early successional habitat sometimes, remembering that not just our forests are less diverse than they were just a few hundred years ago, but also our landscape is less diverse than it was just a few hundred years ago. And we may need to create unique conditions which are providing habitat for different species of wildlife that we're concerned about. So this is another example of sort of diving into that nuance where we're like, let's say that we're managing for forest carbon, creating a big opening like you need to create some early successional young forest habitat is not something that's good for managing forest carbon, but it may be something that is really important for protecting our biodiversity and species that we care about. So we're trying to do many different things at once with the goal of, again, not just sequestering more carbon, not just providing better wildlife habitat, not just providing more timber, but doing all these things at once in service of building a better world. And we also want to protect sensitive and unusual features. So we want to manage not just for healthy, functional forests, but for ecologically healthy, functional landscapes. So again, managing young, simple forests to be more resilient, diverse, and complex, actively in many cases. Keeping large forested blocks intact. This is really important. Keeping them from being fragmented by roads and development. Creating habitats that are underrepresented across our landscape, allowing forests to be unmanaged. So again, diving into what's really radical in many cases is diving into this nuance, and the nuance of like, you can love and believe in forest management and also love and believe in unmanaged forests at the same time. And those two things are not in any way in conflict. And also addressing landscape level threats like, I've said them a million times, deer overpopulation, invasive exotic pests, pathogens, stuff like that. And addressing those biodiversity threats that I just mentioned is really, really important and may require making tough decisions. So I mentioned it before, doing stuff like cutting trees, even if you love trees, killing deer, even if you love deer. I'm not going to harp on this, but in some cases, using herbicide on invasive plants is what we need to do to kill them, even if you're deeply uncomfortable with that, as I am. And creating rules that restrict development in our communities, which is absolutely never going to be something that's popular, but maybe something that we need to do to protect our collective freedom, right? Our collective ability to have ecosystems that are intact and functional in the future. Local renewable resources and turning our focus as communities and landscapes to local renewable resource production and consumption, it cannot be overstated how important this is. So when you're using these resources, local resources, it allows you to know where your resources come from. It allows you to, it forces you to understand that resource production is sometimes messy and uncomfortable, but that if it's not happening in your community, where is it happening, right? It allows you to keep the good parts of resource production at home. So the economic benefits, the benefits of having a vibrant working landscape that's providing economic opportunity in our communities, and helping protect our working lands from development. And I would argue that if there are resources being produced in your community, and if a type of resource production is happening that isn't okay with you in your community, you probably shouldn't be using those resources, right? So one of the most important things that I think is so radical is recognizing that rejecting this not in my backyard mentality, right? So this idea that, right, we don't have a choice if we're going to consume resources. The choice we have is what resources are we going to consume? What are the effects of, what's the effect of our consumption going to be on our ecosystems? And so by choosing to have those effects locally, we have so much more control over what they are. If we say not in my backyard because forest management makes me uncomfortable and I don't like it and it changes the way the forest looks and it makes it look messy, what all you're doing is displacing those impacts on communities and peoples who don't have the privilege to say not in my backyard. It allows us to take charge conducting forest management locally, and local renewable resource production in general allows us to take charge over the environmental social impacts of resource production. Again, these are impacts that are going to happen to our ecosystems. And so if we're using those resources, they should be happening here. And they should be happening in ways that we can keep an eye on and that we can control, rather than us just continually outsourcing those impacts to peoples and ecosystems somewhere else, often at expenses that we wouldn't find acceptable if they were in our communities. It also allows us to have more control over the types of resources we use, if they're renewable resources or non-renewable resources. And it also has some interesting side effects that protect forests. So it makes it more affordable to own land if you can periodically make a little income from them. So that's promoting economic equity in our landowner community. And may also lower development pressure. So providing that little bit of income may prevent people from being taxed off their land or being forced to sell their land for money, which in turn protects forested and other working lands from fragmentation and development. So one of the most challenging things about navigating our complex world is that there aren't simple answers to any of these questions, right? It's radical. And this in and of itself is radical, is to acknowledge that we need to be humble, recognize that we don't have all the answers, and to wade into these uncertain waters where we're seeking complexity and nuance instead of simplicity. It also means being humble enough to acknowledge ourselves as part of something bigger. Acknowledge that our impacts are not restricted to our one piece of land, but may emanate outwards greatly, or the impacts as we consume things similarly. And being humble enough to form worldviews that are supple and that are adaptive, being open to change your mind as information change. We need to really embrace nuance. And this is radical because it's uncomfortable and it's hard. It's easy to just say, oh yeah, forest management, yep, I don't like it. And then I'm never going to think about that again, right? I'm going to take that, I'm going to put it on the shelf, and then I'm going to move on and think about, what kind of boat I want to buy. And what is radical is to have this be an active understanding, and to understand that many of these things that we're talking about are never going to be simple, and to spend the time and the energy and the effort that it's going to be required to form answers, or at least working answers, to some of these really complex questions. It's not about finding a midpoint between polarities. So it's not about saying like, yep, forest management, you're right. Yep, nope. You people who want to just have no management of forests are wrong. It's about deepening and enriching our understanding of the world and of these issues in a way where it's not a spectrum and we want to fall somewhere in the middle. It's a completely different thing where we're blowing up the spectrum and just thinking about all these things in a much more complex way. Again, engaging with nuance, super uncomfortable, super hard, takes a lot of time, takes a lot of effort, and that's what makes it radical. And so again, we need to constantly remind ourselves that with all these things, we don't just want healthy forests, we don't just want healthy human communities, we want to build a better world, right? And that includes both ecological integrity, healthy local and global ecosystems, and also healthy, just, equitable, prosperous, safe, beautiful local and global communities for everybody. All right. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I would love to answer some of your questions.
Yeah, we have some good ones. Thank you, Ethan, first of all. This is great. We have a sort of the full range of questions, everything from sort of like technical harvesting kind of questions to more philosophical questions. So maybe we'll start off with some of the technical stuff. We have a question about what role you see patch cuts playing, like how you feel about like 2 to 5 acre clear cuts and how that fits within like the ecological forestry paradigm.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, here in Vermont, there are a couple of species, especially of birds, woodcock and ruffed grouse, that I know that that are in decline and that we want to provide habitat for. And so we need to, you know, that is something that we want to do and that I think has a role within our landscape. At the same time, it's the nuance, right? Like they're not appropriate everywhere, you know? And so like, given the site, like you don't want to go in and put a 5 acre clear cut on like a really sensitive wetland or that is, you know, comprising some other ecosystem benefit, you know, that is going to be greatly diminished by that patch cut. So again, I think that's definitely something that is important in certain areas and that I've done and that I do. But then you got to sort of engage in the nuance of like, where is that appropriate? When is it appropriate? How is it appropriate? Which is a more complex answer.
We have another question, and maybe this goes back to the trade-off kind of piece that you talked about a little bit, but I wonder if you could address like the trade-offs that a landowner might have to consider if their goals are timber production and carbon sequestration, if those are their 2 main objectives.
Yeah, I actually just did a presentation on this, so which is I clipped down to 30 minutes. If folks can check out my YouTube channel and they can watch a presentation on that as well. So like, you know, those 2 things are potentially compatible, right? So there are ways to manage our forests that are, you know, totally in line with improving carbon sequestration and storage. But at the same time, like harvesting does reduce carbon sequestration and storage a little bit because you're removing those trees as those engines, right, that are sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere. And then you're also going to create some openings, create some more light, some more heat on the forest floor, some more soil disturbance, which is going to cause some of that soil carbon to be released. So yeah, so it's a balance. And then the other aspect of that, there's a whole bunch of different aspects of it. So there's like managing in a way that is leaving lots of carbon and carbon sequestration potential in the forest. So that could be like I was talking about, leaving big trees, leaving lots of dead wood, maybe restricting canopy openings, making them smaller, so that you don't have these big openings where there's a lot of light and a lot of heat, and then you're releasing a lot of carbon. And then you also got to think about resilience and adaptability, right? So I think about sometimes as a good analogy for this, a stream. So like in Vermont, a lot of our streams have been straightened and ditched and otherwise altered. And in order for that stream to get back to sort of a natural condition, to sort of natural, you know, beautiful meandering condition that is ultimately more stable, we need it to erode, right? We need it to create a new channel, which is going to cause erosion, which is ultimately the thing that we're trying to prevent. But it will, a little bit of erosion now will prevent a lot of erosion later because it'll be more stable. In the same way, we can prevent future carbon outputs later, and we can protect our future carbon sequestration ability by making our forests actively more diverse and more resilient sometimes. So that's going to allow them to adapt to future conditions, making them not just one species of tree, but many species of tree, many different ages of trees, buffer them from these large-scale disturbances, which can cause them to be destabilized and to release a lot of carbon all at once. So it's a combination of all those things. And I should add that doing forest management in this way does certainly not necessarily preclude timber management. Like I do these management projects on town forests where we're doing all these things in a way that I think we can be really proud of. And we're doing it within the context of commercial forest management and producing local renewable resources that we're really proud of. So it's just navigating that balance of all those different things is where the sort of complexity comes from, but you can definitely do it. I know you can.
I guess this is my question as sort of I'm a non-forester, I'm a lay person really interested in forestry and forest management. And I feel like the image that I've been trained to view as a positive one when I think about like hand felling operations and conventional operations is like slash cut really low and really
Yeah.
good utilization of top wood.
Yeah.
So if I don't have those as my indicators of a tidy, well done job, as a layperson, when I go out and walk a job with someone or look at a piece of ground, what can I say? What indicators can I say like this was a really well done job versus this was a careless job?
Boy. Yeah. I mean, it's hard, and requires more than sort of a layperson level of understanding, because of course we're not just dealing with out west, a couple different species of trees. We're dealing with many different species of trees which have different attributes, and a big stump of one species of tree might be good in some ways and and bad in other ways. One thing I'll say, a funny story about the slash thing. Now when I'm doing forest management with a community, I ask them to I give them this speech about the two myths, right, which I mentioned in my presentation about forests. One is that forests are supposed to look neat and tidy, like I mentioned. To us, they're gonna look beautiful, but that they're supposed to look neat and tidy in this very specific way. Evenly spaced trees, open understory, that thing that we all look into a forest like that, and we're like, wow, that looks so beautiful. The second myth, and forests don't look that way. The second myth is that forests are static, that they're unchanging, that death is not a part of them, or certainly that it's not something that's good for them in any way. And those are both, of course, completely not true. And so when you accept those two myths, it makes you really look at forest management logging in a completely different way, because people just are applying an unreasonable standard to what forests are supposed to look like after something like that. In the same way that they apply an unreasonable standard to the way that a forest looks after a natural disturbance. With the loggers that I work with, most of them, sort of are older than me, and most of them grew up logging with those same standards, that brush had to be cut below 3 feet high or below knee height. It was in their contract. They had to do it, and people judged them for that. He did a really careful job. All the brush was really, cut really low or whatever. I now put in my contracts that the logger may not cut up brush unless it's absolutely necessary. And it's so interesting, right? Because cutting up brush is dangerous. It takes a lot of time. It's a pain in the ass. And it has absolutely no benefit to the forest at all. And in fact, it actually degrades many of those benefits that are offered by dead wood. And so it's just really, really, one of those weird things. But loggers don't, have a hard time doing that because they think it's going to reflect poorly on the quality of their work. So anyway, so I do a lot of outreach with people where I try and help them understand why that looks the way it looks, and to sort of prepare them for that. But I spend a lot of time encouraging people to look up. So to look at the forest, to look at the trees that have been left, and to from that infer how the quality of the management. So if you can tell what the stumps were and the species that they were and the kind of stuff that they were cutting versus the species that have been retained, it can tell you a lot about the quality of the job. But unfortunately, that's something that's really hard for people to, it's easy for people to see, I guess, if it's like a nicely thinned pine plantation. And it's very complex if it's a northern hardwood forest with 10 different species of trees, each of which is occupying a different ecological role. So I think that's my long way to not answering your question.
No, that's great. Thank you. We have another question. How do we restrict the dominance of industrial scale harvesting on smaller and smaller woodlots and instead preserve smaller scale alternatives in the face of challenging economics? I feel like this is the question. It's the one.
Yeah, no, I think so too. I mean, I think that, one of the just really important things that I think we all need to think about is localness of everything. How do we support these industries locally? Because one of the reasons that forest management and the forest products markets, at least in Vermont, are so messed up is because, they're part of these bigger and bigger global huge markets, when there used to be in Chittenden County, Vermont, hundreds of local markets that you could sell your wood into, and that allowed all different kinds of economics to exist. And it didn't allow like, someone logging with a horse to be subject to the same pulp price when they're trying to cut, do a nice thinning in the spruce stand or whatever, as someone with a feller muncher, who's cutting 50 loads a week or whatever. And so I think that, recreating those local dynamics and local environments by us advocating for them and us supporting them with like our money and with the resources that we consume is part of how we address that. I think that that's more of an issue in Maine than I see in my part of the world, but it is certainly an issue in some parts of Vermont. And I think the best thing I can say is that we need to change our habits, and we need to like really think about critically about focusing more locally.
Gotcha. This is a bit of an equipment question, but how does horse logging sort of fit within the ecological forestry paradigm? Does it fit? I guess.
Yeah, of course it does. Yeah, I mean, I think that horse logging is beautiful. I did it just a little bit, but it was really cool, and it's like obviously just like super surgical and light touch, and you can do beautiful work with horses. And I think that where I see that, there aren't horse loggers where I am that are around. There are some in Vermont, but not local to my area of Vermont. And I would love to see them as just one of the ways that, another tool in our toolkit to manage forests. And I think that there's a lot of good things about a lot of these different harvesting systems used correctly. And they can be used incorrectly too. They're not necessarily good. They're not necessarily good just because of what they are, I guess. But I would love to see horse logging. I could find them plenty of work. The trouble obviously is just like the economics and finding people that want to do it. But it'd be beautiful to figure out a way to make that work, because I think they do amazing work.
We have a question about enrichment planting. My 12 acres of forest is heavy with maple, white birch, and eastern hop hornbeam. I cut a few trees every year for firewood. Should I let the forest regenerate on its own or plant seedlings like cherry, ash, etc., to encourage a more diverse forest?
That's an interesting question. I think that, most of us foresters in the Northeast are spoiled in that we don't plant trees. Like I really don't know that much about planting trees at all, which is hilarious. But we just like create disturbances. We create space, and we let stuff happen. And the way that we create that space and the conditions that we create, hopefully create conditions for a diversity of different species, including some of the ones that we in particular maybe want to grow. We're also blessed with many different commercial species of trees, right? So we have different options, almost regardless of whatever outcome that we create, which is just like such a huge blessing. So that said, there are situations where I think planting is appropriate. I think that there are situations where, some like, I don't believe, I'm not ready to talk about, I guess, full scale like transition planning for climate change, like radically moving ranges of different species around. But I do a little bit on my own land. I do a little bit of range expansion where there's like a couple different species of oak where we're right at the northern end of its range. And I expect that they're going to become more common as our climate changes. And I do take local sources of seed, acorns, and plant them, and hope that I'm sort of like facilitating that transition, because our species are having a hard time catching up with where our climate's at. And we can sort of like facilitate that process. The other example of when I'm advocating for planting is sometimes when we have like an area that's really, really, really infested with invasive exotic plants, and where it's just having a really hard time regenerating anything that's native. So, and I wouldn't necessarily, it would be something that I would think about planting on a case-by-case basis. But in a lot of cases, where you are, where I am, underplanting some acorns just in the ground, just collecting some acorns locally and planting them on a, well-drained site in the understory and just seeing what happens. I don't think that's bad at all. And I think there are other examples where we could think about easy, non really intense invasive ways to sort of facilitate the expansion of ranges of species we expect to be more common without like clear cutting our forests and planting a bunch of tulip poplar or whatever.
We have a sort of a systems question. How can Indigenous people gain more access to land management under our current ownership system? Like, what's the radical forest manager sort of angle on that?
Boy, I don't know. I mean, that's something that I really struggle with myself, right? Is like recognizing that we're on unceded lands, and I like own some of that land, and I guess that's something that I want to explore, but I guess I just don't really have an answer for that right now, except to say that it's a really important question, and I really want to spend more time with it and talk to those communities of Indigenous peoples about what they think about it.
Great. I'm just running through to make sure. I know we've gone a little long, so I really appreciate it. This is just really exciting stuff. So I appreciate you sticking around.
I'm happy to do it.
We've got we did have a question about some of the resources that you cited. I think a lot of interest in that literature, and I wonder if you might be able to either send me or the group sort of a list. I think people are really interested in in these books. So.
Sure. Any ones in particular, Noah?
I guess I'm particularly interested in was it Braiding Sweetgrass?
Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. Yep.
Okay.
I'll send you. We can touch base by email about it, and I'll make sure that folks get some resources.
Perfect. Great. I think we've hit most of the questions. I'll do sort of this is a great segue actually. So we have a question like resources for Mainers, and it's so clear that you're an amazing resource for Vermont. And I might make a pitch while we're here for Maine District Foresters. We actually have Mort Mosswild on the call who works for the Maine Forest Service, and I would absolutely encourage folks in Maine both to reach out to Ethan, but also reach out to their district forester, who can be a great starting point and a great guide. And a bunch of district foresters are involved in LAF in one way or another, whether that's attending our steering committee meetings or instructing at our workshops. So we have great resources here in Maine too, and I think that's certainly worth highlighting. I guess I'll make a copy of the chat and go through after to see if I've missed any questions, but I think we hit all the big ones. So I really appreciate it, Ethan. This is outstanding. It's fun to sort of have some cross-border exchange, which is maybe the lemonade of COVID, I think. I guess as we close, I would just mention that if folks are interested, Low Impact Forestry sends out like a small e-newsletter every month with more information about opportunities like this, workshops that we hold, and sort of relevant news and other resources. I also know, Ethan, you have a pretty awesome YouTube channel, and I'll share a link to that. And that sort of touches on a lot more of the specific topics. I know you just did a video on crop tree release that I thought was great. So I'll share that as well.
Yeah, there's a bunch of stuff on there about all kinds of different stuff, different forest management projects that I've worked with, and you can sort of like follow along what we've done, and then a bunch of recorded webinars, and then created videos about all kinds of different stuff. So yeah, definitely just search for Chittenden County Forester on YouTube and it'll come up.
Perfect. And I think you're also sending out a newsletter. Is that correct?
Yep. Yeah, I send it out periodically and just say what's up with the various things that I'm up to and events that I'm doing and stuff like that. And yeah, and we can send out the link to sign up for that if folks want to as well.
Definitely. Yeah, I'll plan to send out in the next couple of days just a big resources email with your information, probably some information about the Maine Forest Service and all of these other resources, as well as a recording of the video. I guess the last thing I might say is I'll send out an evaluation form for this workshop. It's always helpful for us to figure out how we can do things differently or what went really well. and also topics that we can include for the future. So I'd encourage folks to fill that out. I try to make them really brief, like a minute or two, but it's really helpful for us. So with that, thank you, Ethan. This was really outstanding, and I hope we can continue sharing information in the future. So,
Thank you.
all right, have a good night, everybody.
Night.
Thanks.